Well, welcome to the Great British Woodshop. The other day I was visiting a property right here in Surrey called Polsden Lacey, and I found a couple of tables that were very ingenious, and it got me thinking about what I'd build on today's project. It's a coffee table with a surprise. Polsden Lacey was purchased in 1906 by Mr. and Mrs. Ronald Greville. The architects they hired were instructed to transform Polsden into a house fit for royalty. In the first half of the 20th century, guests were lavishly entertained here, including Edward VII and the late Queen Mother. Now, one of the more intimate rooms here at Polsden Lacey is the study, and there are a couple of fascinating tables in here. This one is a rosewood games table, and it's set up at the moment for a game of chess. Inside there's a backgammon board, and when the top's reversed, it's finished in rosewood, and it matches the drop leaf extensions on either side of the table. The drop leaf is supported by a little arm that folds out, and here there's a drawer that pulls out, and you've got storage in there for some games pieces. Now, this walnut table over here is one of the more ingenious ones that I've ever seen. In this position, it's a side table or a console table, and the gate leg swings out at the back to support the first leaf that opens up and turns this into a tea table. The next leaf folds over and you're left with a card table. And with this next one, you get backgammon and chess. And the table surfaces always stay flat by adjusting the height of the gate leg. And underneath this leaf, there's a place for storage. What a clever piece. Well, here's my coffee table. I built it out of American black walnut. The top is 25mm thick, and it's made up of 4 boards all joined together. The rails on the side and on the ends are joined into the legs with mortise and tenon joinery, and all the legs are tapered on all 4 sides. Now, I know this isn't the final resting place for this piece, but just imagine if you're sitting down watching TV, maybe it's your favourite woodworking show, and you don't want to miss a minute of it. Dinner time comes, here's the solution. The top cantilevers back, and now you have a dining table for 2. Bonus is plenty of storage inside the coffee table, and when you're done, it just folds back down and you're left with an elegant piece of furniture. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is start milling up the pieces for the legs. Now, when I buy my stock down at the timber yard, I usually buy it in the rough and then plane it down to the dimensions that I want. In the case of the legs, they're 75mm square, which meant the rough stock would have had to have been 100mm thick. And I just couldn't find any black walnut in that kind of dimension. And so I picked up this stock at 50mm thick, and I'll join a couple of pieces together to make up the legs. Now, sometimes when you buy hardwood, you have to take the good with the bad, and that's the case with this board. It's okay from this end all the way to about here, but now I've got some major defects, some splits and some cracks. And then further down the board, and there's quite a bit of sapwood here, and I don't like that for the leg, so I'll skip that. I'll get another couple of boards out of here, and down this end here, if I found a piece of defect like this in a wider board, that would have ended up in the top for sure, because I love this kind of detail. But for the leg, it's not going to be any use. And it looks like I'm only going to get 2 legs out of this one piece of stock. And each leg is 390 long, which means I'm going to allow about 800 for the leg. But I can still stay south of the defect here at around about 900. So I'll make a cut here, and I'll get 2 half legs out of this end. Now, they refer to boards that have been planed as PAR, which stands for planed all round. That's certainly what these were, but it doesn't mean they're going to be flat and square. Have a look at this board here. It's very bowed, and I certainly can't join those 2 together. So I'm going to have to take that to the jointer and flatten it out. If I'm clever about how I get this board milled, I'll be able to get a 75mm board out of here, and I'll also be able to remove this sapwood, and that'll give me a uniform colour. Now, not only is this board bowed, but it's also twisted. So a few passes over the joiner will turn this into a flat board. Now, tool guards are an important safety feature, and any time I ever remove them is so you can see what I'm actually doing more clearly. Now I'll put this face against the fence and square up this edge. Now it goes through the thickness planer to make this face parallel to this one. Now it's one pass through the saw with the fence set to 76mm, and that'll leave me 1mm to clean up the rough sawn edge on the joiner. I've set the stop on my fence to 390mm, and that'll make sure that all of the boards for all of the legs are exactly the same length. I'm ready to join these boards together, and I'm just marking the positions for a couple of biscuits. I'm going to join these with biscuit slots in the center. Now I've set the fence to the maximum depth, and I'm going to line up the red indicator mark with the pencil line and cut the slot. Now the biscuits aren't for strength, they're there to locate the two boards together, because as soon as I put glue on these surfaces and try and clamp it up, they'll want to wiggle about, and the biscuits will stop that from happening. I'm going to put some glue on both surfaces. This helps with glue up time. So just roll the glue out. A little glue on the biscuit, and then wipe up as much glue as I can now. Now when these legs are dry, I'm going to cut some mortises into them and add some other details, but for now I'm going to cut these rails to length and then put some tenons on the ends of them. Now both the short rails need to be cut to a length of 474, and to make sure that happens, I've set my reference stop to that dimension. I'm going to square up one end, and then I'll make the cut to the right length. Well, I designed this coffee table to suit my sofa, but it's a very flexible design. You can have it any length you want just by varying the length of the long rails and the top. Now the first thing to do in marking up for these tenons is to mark a center line. Now this stock is 19mm wide, and I'm going to put a mark at 9.5 and then join them with a line. And then later I'm going to run a groove down the inside, and that's where the base of the coffee table is going to sit. So I want to offset the tenon, so I'm going to come up 25mm and come down 15mm. To cut the tenons, I'm going to use a mortise and tenon jig. And the good thing about a jig is that once it's set up, every time you make a cut, it'll be exactly the same. Now the first part is to slide the stock up underneath until it hits this little tab. And that's a reference stop. And just tighten the clamps to hold the stock in place. Now the next thing to do is to set this top plate, and that moves backwards and forwards to cope with different widths of stock. Now that center line I drew before on my pencil is what I'm going to use to line up the setup bar to make sure that this top plate is centered exactly over the top of the stock, and then lock it in place. Now there are two other things I need to do before the jig is set up completely. One is to set the tenon length, and the other is the tenon width. Now this stock is 19mm wide, so I've selected a tenon width of 16mm. But you can have a choice of anything from 6mm to 16mm. For a 16mm wide tenon width, I need a bush to go in the bottom base of the router at 22mm. Now I've set the depth of the cutter so it's at 15mm, and this bush is going to ride around the inside edge of this plate. As it does, it'll leave the tenon in the center and remove the material around the outside. And with each subsequent pass, I'll lower the bit a little bit more until I remove all the material, and I'm doing that in stages so I don't overload the cutter. Now the jig does a great job of cutting the tenon, but this board is wider than the jig can accommodate, and that's why I'm left with this little piece of material here on the end. So I'm going to trim that off at the table saw. With tenons cut on all the rails, the next thing I'm going to do is run this groove down the inside edge for the base of the coffee table. And to do that, I've set up a 13mm straight cutting bit in the table. I've raised it up so it's 10mm above the surface of the table, and I've set the fence the correct distance away. Now it's back to the legs, and before I start marking out for the mortises, I'm just going to clean up this glue staining on here with my random orbit sander. Now the leg is too big to fit into the mortise and tenon jig, so I've just clamped it in the side vise, and I've marked out for the mortises. I've come down 15mm from the top and put a line, that's where I'll start the cut, and then I made a line 75mm away from there where I'll stop the cut. And the 75mm is the length of the tenon. Now I've still got the 16mm bit set up in the router, and I've added a fence, and that's to position the mortise in the center of the leg. And now I'll just remove the material between the two lines. Well, during the break, I'll finish the rest of the mortises, and then when we come back, I'll add some shape and detail to the legs. Welcome back to the Great British Woodshop. Today's project is a coffee table. It's built out of American black walnut, and it has a little special feature to it. It converts into a dining table for two while you're watching your favorite TV show. Now before the break, I was finishing the mortises in these legs, which I've now done. And the next thing I want to do is cut this sunk bead detail into the side of all of the legs. Now to do that, I've set up a 6.3mm radius cutter in the table, and I'm using the sliding miter gauge off my table saw because I've got the fence stop on here that I can slide the material up against and hold it in place. Now as I push it over the cutter, it'll cut that concave radius, and each time I rotate the board, I'll push it through until I get all four sides cut. All the legs get tapered on all four sides, and when I made this original, I made up this wooden template to do that. Trace a line. Then I'll rough it out at the bandsaw and then sand it back to the line at the sanding station. Now to mark out for the other two sides, I'll use the template again, center it on the board, and mark down each side. Now I'll remove any of the marks caused by the sanding station with some 120 grit paper and the random orbit sander. And the last detail is to chamfer the bottom of the legs, and that's to prevent any chipping if the table gets dragged around the floor. Now before I can glue up the base, I'm going to soften all the bottom edges of all the rails, and that's just so that if you stick your shins underneath the coffee table, there's no sharp edges under there to do any damage. And to do that, I'm going to use a portion of a 6.3mm radius overload cutter and round over all the edges. Now the frame of the coffee table gets glued up in two stages. I'm gluing up the long rails first, a little bit of glue in the mortise and on the tenons. I'll hold it in the clamp, and I'll just put a couple of these little plywood blocks just to protect the walnut from damage as I tighten up the clamp head. I'm also going to add a second clamp to this side. That's just so I can distribute the pressure evenly either side of the joint. And we'll just check it for square. That's good. While this dries, we'll get started working on the top. Now, the top for the coffee table came out of rough material like this, and the finished dimension I wanted for the top is 25mm thick. So I bought this rough stock at 38. Now this stuff doesn't look particularly attractive in the rough, but once you've milled it, it finishes beautifully. And once you've done that, as I have to these four boards that we'll use for our top, the next thing you want to do is have a look at the color variation and the quality of the surface that you want facing up. And on this first board, we've got a considerable amount of variation here. And on this side, it's a lot more uniform, and I like that look better, so that will go up. On this board, I've got a little bit of a knot down here. And again, this side looks good, so that can stay up. On this one, we've got, again, color variation and a knot down here. Better color, but another knot, but we can live with that one. And this one here looks good both sides, so that can stay as it is. The next thing I want to take a look at is the growth rings. Now, anytime you're gluing up boards for a wide top, you want to try and keep it as flat and stable as you possibly can. And the way to do that is to look at the growth rings. On this first board here, the curve is this way. The growth rings sit like this, which means the board wants to cup in this direction. On the board next to it, we're lucky that the growth rings are going down, which means it'll counteract the forces acting on this one. And that's what we do as we go all the way across the board. This one now cups up, and this one is also cupping up, so we can turn that one over. Now all of those forces should equal, and that'll help keep the top stable. I'm going to join these boards together with glue and biscuits. And now I'm just going to mark some positions for those biscuit slots. And I'm going to put 4 biscuits in each board. I'm going to cut slots for number 20 biscuits, so I'll set the gauge to that. I've also adjusted the height of the fence so that the cutter will be in the center of the board. And then I'll just line up the red indicator line with the pencil mark and make the cut. Now I'm going to glue these boards up in pairs, and then once I've got that done, I'll glue the two pairs together. I've chosen a special wood glue. It's a tinted glue, tinted for dark woods. Now a little glue on the biscuits and into the slot. Now biscuits have been around for quite a while, but I really find them an indispensable accessory to have around the workshop, particularly for jobs like this. And these biscuits are made of beech, and they're also checked. They're stamped with both the size of the biscuit, and also there's these little checks in here that holds the glue. And as it does that, it absorbs the glue, and these biscuits expand in the joint. It makes for a very tight fit. And the slot that the biscuit cutters make is slightly oversized to the biscuit, and that allows you for a little bit of adjustment as you're gluing up. Walnut's used for a variety of purposes, everything from fine cabinet making to boat building, to rifle stocks. It's a very versatile wood. Now walnut glues well, it screws and nails well, and it takes finish beautifully. There's a certain frantic quality about gluing up, trying to get all of the biscuits in place and all the surfaces glued before the glue starts to set up. And it's all part of the fun. I'm just using a couple of blocks of plywood on the ends to protect the wood from being damaged as I tighten the clamps up. Now I'm just wiping it up with a damp sponge. Much easier to get it off now than it is to try and get it off later once it's dried. I've got most of that glue off, and I'm just adding some additional clamps to the top, and that'll distribute the pressure, the clamping pressure, evenly across both top and bottom surfaces, and that'll help keep it flat too. Now the only piece of wood in this project that's not solid walnut is this base, and it's cherry veneered MDF, 13mm thick. And the only reason I picked up cherry was when I went down to the timber yard, they didn't have any walnut. But it's got a similar grain pattern, so I'll add a little walnut stain to it later. Next thing I'm going to do is to cut it to length and width, and then I'll notch out the corners so they'll fit around the legs. Well, now I can glue up the second part of the base with a little bit of glue in the mortises. Next I'll slide in the base. And you can see how the notch just fits around those legs. And no glue in there, that can just sit in there and float. And it'll be held by the grooves. Now a little more glue onto the top of the tenons and a little bit in the mortise. I'll put this piece on top, and then I'll be ready to clamp it up. And then I'll leave this in the clamps for about a half an hour. Now what turns the coffee table into a dining table is this pop-up mechanism. And I bought this from a woodworking catalogue. All I need to do at this point is to center it in the opening. Looks pretty good. And I'll put a couple of reference lines so I can locate it more easily again later. And I'll just pop this open. And it's going to want to spring right up. There it goes. I'll just line these up with my reference marks. On either side, and I can mark through for where I'll drill some holes for some machine screws, and I'm going to be putting 4, one in each corner, and they're M4s, and I'll put a washer and a lock nut on there to hold it in place. Well, the top's had a couple of hours in the clamps to dry, and now I'm going to give it a sanding with some 120 grit paper in the random orbit sander. Now before I give the top a final sanding with some 240 grit paper, I'm just going to soften the top edge of the coffee table with a 6.3mm radius rounding over bit installed in my handheld router. And now I'm ready to give it its final sanding with some 240 grit paper. Alright, well I've positioned the top carefully on the base, and this mechanism inside here is sprung loaded and it wants to lift this top up. So I'm just going to give it a helping hand, relieving a little bit of the weight, and very carefully lift it so it doesn't move. And then I'll mark positions for the screws from underneath. Anytime you're screwing into hardwood, it's a good idea to drill a pilot hole. I'm using a 3mm brad point bit for that. And I'm just using the square to keep the drill at 90 degrees to the top. And the tape's on the drill bit just to stop me from going too far and going through the top. And when that's done, this piece will go into the finishing shop. Now I've vacuumed off the top, and I'm just wiping it over with a tack rag, which is just a piece of cloth with an impregnated resin that picks up any of the dust that's left on the surface. And that'll prevent the finish from being spoiled. Now the finish I picked for this project is an oil finish. And it's a terrific choice for a coffee table because oil is resistant to moisture and to heat, and it'll also bring out the grain. I'll leave this oil sit on here for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll wipe it over with a rag to remove any excess. Well, next I'm going to apply the walnut stain to the cherry veneered MDF. Well, this coffee table is the perfect match for my favourite sofa. And I'm pretty happy with how the walnut stain took to the cherry veneered MDF. Now remember, this is a project that you can customise to fit your favourite sofa. I'm David Free, this is the Great British Woodshop. We'll see you again soon.